The first thing people ask when I tell them the story is how something so small could swallow a family whole. And I always think about the morning I packed a single backpack and closed my bedroom door for good while the house that raised me arranged itself around someone else's ears. I remember the weight of the backpack on my shoulder like a future sentence, and the way the hallway looked different with a map taped to the carpet, white, laminated, arrows in permanent marker that told me where I was allowed to walk. That was the moment the house stopped being mine and became a course I had to follow to avoid setting off an alarm nobody else heard. I grew up in a split level with blue shutters on the east side of Columbus, a place where Laura made lasagna like it was a religion, and James mowed the lawn on Saturday mornings at 7 because that's what he'd always done. We were a talk loud, hug hard kind of family. My sister Madison and I used to joke in the car about how loud Columbus drivers were, about how we could hear each other's footsteps in the attic at night and laugh about it over $2 coffee. I was a grad student at Ohio State then, knee-deep in research and teaching sections, and Madison was the kid who could steal fries off my plate when she thought I wasn't looking. We were close enough that her return home after a semester away felt natural at first, like I was getting the extra coffee cup I had misplaced. Madison came back with a diagnosis and a quiet urgency I hadn't seen before, waving a printed PDF of an intake note and talking about noises as if they were throwing darts at her brain. She called it sensory sensitivity, letters and acronyms falling out of her mouth like talismans. The lights are in my head, it's like something keeps scratching inside. At first I did the small things because she was my kid sister and because my parents made it sound reasonable. I wore foam slippers that looked like I was auditioning for a hospital PSA. They made a ridiculous rubber thump on the hardwood, and somehow everyone pretended it was less humiliating than not wearing them at all. Laura smiled like a soldier at a parade when I put them on. James shrugged like a man hoping the war would be short. The practicalities slid into place quietly, the way mold creeps behind baseboards. A Decibel app appeared on Madison's phone with a brushed aluminum icon that made a soft whoosh whenever she checked it, the numbers climbing and falling like a mood ring. At first the app was a novelty, we'd laugh, whisper, and record the sound of someone turning a page, but the laughs dried up when she started writing down the numbers in a spiral notebook titled Triggers. That spiral notebook became evidence before anyone called it that. Then came the runners, narrow, plush strips bought online for $350 because thin rugs create deep impact. Madison told my parents over dinner like she'd learned the language of consumer therapy. They were placed in a single-file trail from the kitchen to the back door, too narrow for 2 feet to cross side by side. And a map, laminated and taped to the hallway carpet, showed the allowed paths in red marker with the words no crossing above them like a verdict. I learned to walk like an actor in a bad play, playing stillness between breaths, counting steps in my head to make sure I hit the soft parts of the runners. The slippers made my strides clumsy, the runners made them ritualized. Maya, my ex, who used to drag me to punk shows and mock me for crying at movies, watched it all like it was another country and then like a country she could not immigrate to. She started staying later less often, then sent one text, then another, each shorter and blunter. I can't watch you disappear for someone who won't look in a real mirror. The last thing she said to me in person was as I sat on the edge of the sofa, a Decibel reading whooshing on Madison's phone across the room like a metronome for my shame, and Maya kissed the top of my head like she was tucking a child into a nightmare and walked out the front door. The binder arrived like a Bible, 3-ring and serious, its cover labeled with a Sharpie that said sensory log in Madison's tidy handwriting, and the first time I opened it I thought it was a joke until I hit the page with my name on it and a list of timestamps that looked like court notes. Each entry had a date, a time, a Decibel number pulled from her phone app, and a short judgment. 3/12/07/15 footsteps 42 dB triggered, Aaron warned. There were printed screenshots of the app with little waveforms, audio files named Aaron 03/12/0715, MP3 burned onto a CD, and laminated daily schedules that read like prison rotas. Quiet block 6:00 AM, quiet block 9:00 PM, each period outlined in highlighter and sealed by Madison with the kind of certainty a person uses when signing a will. We had a family meeting in the den one Wednesday night because Madison wanted clear rules, and because my parents were exhausted by the wordplex of therapy appointments and specialist recommendations. Laura folded her hands like a mediator and James kept rubbing the sweat from his lip with the back of his wrist, like he was trying to wipe away responsibility. Madison took the binder and, without looking at me, cued an audio file on her phone and played it over the cheap speakers. There I was, walking the short distance from my bedroom to the kitchen, a small, normal human task that suddenly sounded enormous in a recording that had been edited for maximum effect, footsteps exaggerated by a high-pass filter, a metronomic squeak accentuated until it thudded. Madison watched my parents' faces change the way a director watches a scene fall into place. "Do you hear how it spikes?" she asked, and Laura nodded until her throat bobbed. They installed motion sensors in the hallway less than a week later. Little white puck-shaped things that blinked a tiny red LED whenever anyone passed, and they connected to an app Madison could refresh at will. I remember standing in the doorway while the first sensor registered me and lit up like a tiny, accusing eye. James pretended it was about safety, as if my presence was a hazard that needed monitoring. The next escalation was framed as compassion. "It would be more private for everyone," Laura said in the kitchen, stirring coffee like it would dissolve the awkwardness, and James cleared his throat as though he hadn't cleared an entire life with a single sentence. "You can sleep in the garage. It's quieter out there, Aaron, you'll have space." The detached garage smelled like the kind of place things go to be forgotten. Oil-soaked rags under a pegboard, a faint chemical tang that haunted the back wall where old paint cans sat, an underlying dust that caught in my nose and refused to leave. They put a single lamp with a yellowed shade on a cracked tool chest and a space heater humming dangerously close to a pair of fuel cans. I slept on a thin mattress that felt like a paper apology, listening to the heater tick and imagining sparks. The hum of the heater became its own soundtrack, low, mechanical, and somehow more honest than the conversations we'd been having. When the wind came through the rim of the garage door, it carried neighbor sounds like proof I still existed. A dog barked 2 houses over, a bicycle chain clinking, someone laughing at a backyard grill. People noticed. Mrs. Holloway from next door asked me at the mailbox if I was staying with friends. And Tom, our church youth leader, stopped in for what he called a check-in, but left with a furrowed brow that I knew from counseling sessions meant he was confused. Laura and James found language to sell the story to anyone who asked. "We were protecting Madison's disability," they said. "We were making accommodations agreed upon by professionals." Family friends nodded because they wanted to believe they were doing the right thing, and its simplicity made them defer. Some people said, in softer voices at barbecues, that boundaries are hard but necessary, and others avoided us completely because messy family stuff is awkward to watch up close. Inside the garage, under that lamp and beside the humming heater, I cataloged humiliation like a second job, and the binder's folded pages waited inside the house like a judge sharpening a gavel. I didn't know then that the quiet wasn't just about decibels. It was the sound of a life being erased in slow motion, and that silence would become the instrument of everything that followed. I left the garage with 2 trash bags and a phone full of apology texts I couldn't answer. And when I pulled up to Carolyn and David's house, my hands were shaking like I'd run a marathon I didn't sign up for. They met me on the porch like people who had been waiting for a family emergency to become real, and Carolyn took one look at my face and said, "We'll patch you up here," like that was a simple stitch and not a seam being ripped. I remember the smell of her kitchen, lemon cleaner, and the faint roast from whatever she was making, and the way David hugged me like he was trying to squeeze the shame out of my shoulders. Carolyn turned the spare room into a small fortress. She lined the windows with thick curtains and bought a roll of foam that hissed as she unrolled it, tucking it into the closet to block sound. She hummed while she worked, and when she handed me a ridiculous pair of soft house slippers, I felt the old embarrassment all over again, but her eyes were steady. "These are for walking, not for hiding," she said, and then she made coffee like a normal person trying to re-anchor a life that had tilted. David put a futon in the wall and set up a desk with a lamp, and the last thing he did before leaving me to sleep was check the deadbolt twice, as if locks could be a kind of therapy. The first morning at their kitchen table, I pulled Carolyn's laptop toward me because I had to do something besides stare at the walls. She was digging a small soundproof panel into the closet like a woman setting up a fortress of care. I opened her mail client to research college accommodations, how to restore a student account, what paperwork a registrar might accept, and that was when I saw it, an email half open with a subject line that read payment confirmation and an attached PDF receipt for tuition. My chest tightened when I saw the figure and the date. The payment was months old and matched an amount parents wouldn't blink at, and the receipt had Madison's name and a confirmation number with a timestamp. It felt like dropping a book off a high shelf and hearing all the pages scatter. I did something I would have sworn I never would. I called the university, and with my voice thin and fake, I said I was Madison and asked if the payment posted. The registrar's office had that studied patience of people who deal with battered logistics, and they asked a few verification questions I answered with trembling honesty. Madison Mitchell. No enrollment on file in the last 14 months. the woman said plainly, and then softer. Her last record shows an academic dismissal for plagiarism 14 months ago. The words landed like cold stones. I asked about the payment and she read back a ledger line like it was the least interesting thing in the world. Payment received, applied to account, balance zero, no active registration. I sat back as if the chair had flipped me. The receipts on my aunt's screen made sense on paper and made no sense in life. Someone had been moving money around like stitches to cover a wound that didn't exist. I felt the air go thin and metallic, and my hands started to shake so badly I had to set the mug down. Carolyn watched me, and when I said the words out loud, she reached for my hand like it was a first aid kit. "We will get copies," she said, calm as a librarian, and she already had a list of phone numbers. Sophie showed up with a thermos of bad coffee and a look like she'd been waiting for this kind of broken truth. She'd been my friend since undergrad, and she handed me a zip file of chat logs she'd saved months earlier because she didn't trust anything that looked like a narrative. "I thought you'd want proof," she said, and the files were small lights in the dark, screenshots of Madison complaining about classes she wasn't attending, texts where she begged for cash and then bragged about getting it. Caleb came later looking like someone who had lost a bet with his past, and he slid his phone across the table. His screenshots were cruel in their clarity. Messages from Madison to a friend boasting, time-stamped and brittle, about the art of pushing my parents' buttons. Seeing those threads together, the receipt, the registrar's voice, Sophie's careful logs, Caleb's smug screenshots, felt like the first time a fog starts to lift, and you realize the road you were on was paved by someone else's hands. The next layer of the mess felt like reading someone else's handwriting on my life. It started with a screenshot Caleb slid across the kitchen table, and my eyes stuck to the top line, withdrawal confirmation, 11:12 p.m. The image was ugly in a way that made my stomach flip. A plain email header, a subject line that sounded like a dead end, and a timestamp I could not unsee. Underneath, it was a transaction ID and a tiny line that said submitted from IP, 73124591. My aunt's lamp pooled light on the image and the world narrowed to that number, and for a second I couldn't tell if I was reading a receipt or a crime report. I asked for more, and Sophie, calm and steady like the friend she is, opened the full email headers and magnified them until the lines blurred with meaning. There it was in black and white, received, from 73124591 unknown 73124591 by mail University Edu with ESMTPSA date, 11:12:03 p.m. message ID, WXR 239 at University Edu. The digits matched other headers in a chain we pulled. 2 outgoing emails to Madison's account, a password reset request, and a notification about a financial hold, all routed through that same IP block. Sophie printed the pages like evidence is best made heavy, and when I looked at the printout, my hands went from shaking to numb. I called the registrar with the kind of voice that was trying to be steady and sounding like a kid playing a very bad role in a play. The woman on the other end was blunt in a way I needed. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "we have a withdrawal on file, timestamped 11:12 p.m. on that date. It lists a student-initiated withdrawal. We can't reverse that without a police report showing fraud and the department chair's approval." Her tone folded the air right out of the room. "You'll also need to request reinstatement formally within 48 hours or the seat is forfeited." 48 hours. The number felt like bait on a wire, and I swallowed hard and said, "I'm coming in." While I was still on the line, I asked about message routing, because somewhere in this maze, a single strand might unspool the rest. The registrar's tech staff sent me a portal screenshot within an hour, an account settings page showing a forwarding rule, every message to my university address forwarded to an external email at 11:12 p.m. on the same night the withdrawal was submitted. The screenshot showed the forwarding address in full and a little note, "Filter set active." I stared at that filter like it was a map to a hidden room. Who sets a filter to steal someone's life? The answer smelled worse than anything in the garage. The pattern hardened when Caleb found bank emails and receipts that matched tuition amounts, but were addressed to a card number I didn't recognize. I logged into one of the credit monitoring sites on my aunt's clunky laptop out of a kind of numb curiosity, and then the air left me in a different way. There were 3 new cards with balances and limits totaling $22,000 opened in my name in the last year. My body reacted like someone had broken a rib. The punch landed in the hollow behind my liver, and everything went brown at the edges. I felt like I might throw up, and instead I laughed, a short, wet sound no one should hear in daylight. I called the banks. The fraud departments were efficient and mildly disgusted, and they read me lists of account numbers and merchant names that meant nothing until they were all inked on paper. One investigator, a man with gravel in his voice who introduced himself as Detective Hargrove, told me he had seen identity theft look like a shopping spree before, but not usually braided into a family living room. "This is escalation," he said, and then he asked me if I would come down to the station to file a report. Filing the report felt like the first honest thing I'd done in months. By the time night closed the kitchen windows, the crumbs of evidence, the 11:12 p.m. withdrawal screenshot, the identical IP digits on 3 different headers, the forwarding rule that rerouted my entire student life, the $22,000 in credit opened under my name were stacked on the table like the only facts left after someone burned the rest. I slept badly under my aunt's patched curtains, the lamp clicking off in the next room, and I woke with a plan to make every small crooked line in those emails face the light. The plan was messy and expensive and slow, but it was the only thing that felt like reclaiming the world one truth at a time. I woke up before the sun because the clock on the microwave was a dull electric thing and worry doesn't let you sleep. Carolyn drove us to campus with a thermos between us and a quiet that felt like strategy. The highway smelled like wet asphalt and the radio was off because noise felt like a risk. I clutched a manila folder that had printouts, the 11:12 p.m. withdrawal screenshot, the forwarded email rule showing Madison's forwarding address, the IP trace Sophie had printed. And when we pulled into the university lot, I felt like a kid sneaking into class with a cheat sheet that was actually a subpoena. The registrar's office was bright and grammar school clean, and the woman behind the desk read my stack like someone who had handled bad paperwork 12 times that week. "We can reverse a student-initiated withdrawal," she said, without mercy or malice, "but you need a police report proving fraud and your department chair must approve reinstatement. You have 48 hours before your spot is automatically released." The number hit like a bell. 48 hours to prove someone wiped me off the roster. I felt the air in my lungs shrink and the world compressed down to a deadline and a list. We walked across campus toward the department like we were carrying an injured animal. The department head, Dr. Lang, met me in her office with an impatient kindness that felt like an exam. She flipped through my screenshots, scrolled through headers, and then looked up with the faintest crease between her eyebrows. "I'll readmit you on the condition you show proof you were prevented from attending and you complete the missing coursework quickly," she said. Her words were both lifeline and vice. I could come back, but I had to prove my absence was not by choice and compress months of work into days. She set a deadline for a formal petition and emailed faculty with a single line that felt like a bell, "Temporary reinstatement pending verification." What followed was a blur of generosity and caffeine. Sophie turned into an organizer overnight, throwing together schedules, emailing my graders, and texting classmates like she was running a rescue. People I barely knew offered time and notes. A lab partner named Jamal came in with stacks of problem sets at noon, and we sat in a study room with bad fluorescent light until it looked like morning on the clock. Professors who were usually strict gave conditional extensions, and one older lecturer left a sticky note that said, "Do what you can, we'll fill the gaps." The kindness felt fragile and immense at once, and I kept thinking about how often systems rely on unpaid favors when they claim to be fair. At the police station, Detective Hargrove listened with a bored patience until I handed him bank emails that showed $22,000 in accounts opened in my name. His posture changed like someone switching tools. The gravel in his voice sharpened into a tension. "Identity theft plus credit fraud gives us probable cause," he said, and suddenly things I'd thought of as private humiliation entered the blue language of investigation. He took my statement, photographed my documents, and told me he would run the IP through records and contact the bank investigators. Filing the report felt like trading a secret for a ledger. It didn't fix anything immediately, but it stopped the slow erasure from being polite. The next 48 hours were a test of human endurance and communal pressure. I drank 3 pots of coffee I probably didn't need, my hands buzzed with adrenal jitter, and I typed until my eyes were raw. Classmates sent annotated slides at 2 in the morning, and Sophie slept in my aunt's guest room with her phone on, ready to wake and scan anything that arrived. The university's admin machines hummed, and people called back with odd bureaucratic kindness. Signatures and stamps and crossover emails that felt like a patchwork bridge built in a hurry. When the deadline arrived, I handed Dr. Lang a packet that looked like evidence. The police case number, screenshots of the forwarding rule, the IP trace, a printout of the withdrawal email. She read it slowly and then said, "This will do for now. Start the coursework. We'll reconvene in a week." Relief was immediate and wet and complicated. I felt grateful and guilty, like someone who had been given a second chance but whose hands were still shaking from the shove that knocked me down. The race had bought me time, but it had also shown me how close I had come to losing everything because someone decided to rearrange my life for their gain. Sophie became my anchor. She sat with me for hours, her phone lit like a tiny flashlight as she scrolled through months of texts she had saved, then took those logs to a notary and signed a statement saying what she'd seen and when. Her notarized witness statement described Madison's dramatic messages, the times she posted club photos while claiming to be bedridden, and the late-night requests for cash that looked more like shopping orders than medical care. Holding Sophie's paper felt like holding a small, honest thing in a house full of lies. Caleb was quieter but sharp. He slid his phone across the table and let me take screenshots, timestamps and images of Madison dancing in a bar at 2 a.m., a group shot with a red Solo cup, a video of her laughing in a crowd while her text log claimed she couldn't leave her bed. Seeing those images next to the trigger entries in her binder felt obscene. It was like watching someone rehearse a role in private while accusing someone else of breaking character in public. Caleb was embarrassed to be involved, but he showed up and gave me everything he had without fanfare. Dr. Rachel Hayes agreed to help before I could fully explain the mess. She is an ADHD specialist with a steady voice and skin that reads like someone who has sat with suffering enough to know the difference between symptom and performance. She reviewed Madison's sensory descriptions, the app readings, and the audio clips. She told me plainly that the pattern of behavior, scripted episodes, selective disability tied solidly to situations where financial benefit or attention was possible, did not match known neurological presentations. She said she would be willing to evaluate Madison and testify if the court needed a clinical opinion. Her agreement felt like a professional light turning on in a dark room. My Aunt Carolyn set up the call that would shake the house. She put her speakerphone on the kitchen table like a gavel and called my parents, and when Laura's voice came through thin and apologetic, I put the printed tuition ledger up so everyone could see it. I read out line items, payments, dates, confirmation numbers, and a bank receipt showing where the money had come from. I opened a laptop and tried a portal login to show how Madison had changed the password 2 years earlier, a failed attempt returning an error message with a timestamp and a little note. Password last changed by user March 7, 2023. The screen looked so small and so huge, and Carolyn's voice was steady when she said, "Do you know what this looks like?" There was a long, wet silence on the line before James started to cry. Laura's voice sounded different, like someone walking through a house that had a ceiling that might fall in. They scrambled, half explanations, half excuses, a flurry of "we thought," and "we didn't see that," read like someone patching a net after the fish are gone. Their apologies came quick, rough as poorly sewn seams. Then they tried to make it right the way they always had, promises and money. They told me they'd set everything straight, offered to replace the cards, and begged me not to involve the police. Their pleading was a storm of sincerity and cowardice at once. The next thing surprised me in the worst way. An expensive family lawyer called and offered terms. The lawyer's voice was practiced, smooth as a polished coin, and he said plainly that the family wanted to avoid court and would write a check for $150,000 if I agreed to drop the charges and sign an NDA. He described confidentiality like it was charity. My aunt put the call on speaker so my parents could hear every line, and I pressed record on my phone because I had spent too many days holding indignity in my chest to trust a memory. I forwarded that recording to the prosecutor the next morning instead of taking an envelope with a corner of paper and a figure meant to buy silence. Sending it felt like air clearing. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wanted facts to stand in daylight and consequences to be honest. The prosecutor called back within the day and said they were already reviewing the materials. When you refuse a bribe and the system notices, it makes a kind of moral gravity that I hadn't known I still had. The family's panic was loud after that, but the panic didn't change what had been gathered. Notarized statements, screenshots, clinical willingness to testify, financial ledgers, and a recorded offer to bury the whole thing. Those things were small, heavy truths, and they were ready to be used. The courthouse smelled like rain and old coffee the day we walked in, and I kept my hands folded so they wouldn't tremble. I had rehearsed calm in the garage and in hotel rooms, but nothing prepares you for a room full of people whose whole job is to watch you stand naked in truth. Madison was arrested a week before the trial after a warrant was issued. She posted bail, walked out on a smoky afternoon, and then not 2 days later sent me a message that said, "Keep quiet or you'll regret it." Timestamped 9:17 p.m., which the prosecutor used to add an intimidation charge. Seeing that message printed in court felt like someone had stamped my chest with a brand. Depositions were exhaustive and ugly in the best way, ugly because they cleared away the pretty lies. Sophie and Caleb sat in the witness room and replayed chats and timestamps that matched bank receipts. We handed receipts to the clerk that showed $48,000 in tuition payments with confirmation numbers and merchant codes, but the university records showed no registration for Madison during that period. One receipt had a merchant line item that read Designer Boutique, dated the very day I was moved to the garage. The card slip showed Madison's name and an authorization code. The image of that receipt felt like a photograph of a life I had only known as absence. Forensics testified in a voice that made technology sound like a witness stand. A cyber analyst from the registrar's office explained how the withdrawal email carried metadata and an originating IP that matched the home router at my parents' address. He pulled ISP logs that linked the router fingerprint to the timestamp 11:12 p.m., and he demonstrated how the same IP block appeared on other messages that changed passwords and set up forwarding rules. It was technical and dry, but it read like a compass. Every line pointed back to a place and made it harder for Madison to say the withdrawal just happened. Dr. Rachel Hayes took the stand and spoke plainly about neurology. She listened to Madison's audio clips and read the sensory diary, then told the jury what I already felt. The pattern of selective symptoms tied to gain, the theatrical timing, and the way alleged crises coincided with new purchases did not fit known medical presentations. She explained, in language a jury could hold, that real neurological disorders show consistency across contexts and do not align so neatly with financial advantage. Her testimony was clinical, but it landed like something real and solid in a trial that otherwise risked turning into he said she said noise. Madison chose a brief period to represent herself, and that was the crack in her story. She got sloppy and defensive. She tried to paint the money as help I needed, and then in the middle of a defense that felt rehearsed, she said, "I used his accounts because no one believed me." Those words came out like a confession, and the prosecutor's face changed to a calm shark. Under cross-examination, she flailed, and what sounded like desperate justification became admissions that law interprets plainly as identity theft and fraud. Watching her unravel was complicated. Revenge felt small and insufficient next to the sense of loss. When I testified, the court let me speak for hours. I told the simple shape of things: the foam slippers, the runners, the map on the floor, the lamp in the garage, the way my life narrowed to small movements. I spoke about the mechanics and the cost, the $22,000 in cards opened in my name, the tuition receipts that bought nothing for me, and the recorded offer of $150,000 meant to seal my silence. I stayed composed enough to be heard and raw enough that the jurors didn't just hear facts, but felt the way those facts had been my life. The jury convicted Madison on counts of identity theft, credit card fraud, and intimidation. The judge called the behavior calculated and familial in nature, and handed down a multi-year sentence, ordered restitution of $85,000, and publicly admonished my parents for attempted interference and for their lawyer's payoff offer. The rebuke was formal, sharp, and it landed like a verdict on its own. Money cannot bury truth, and even in the messy, private places where families fail, the law still expects some line to be kept. I left the courthouse empty and full at the same time, relieved that the papers matched the pain, but knowing that a sentence would not stitch the family back the way it had been. I turned the offer down. The check on the table, the whispered promises, felt like an attempt to buy my silence and my life back in coin, and I mailed the recording to the prosecutor instead. Saying no wasn't dramatic, it was a slow, steady thing I learned to do in therapy, but it was the first clear line I drew in months, the first boundary I set that wasn't someone else's idea of kindness. Therapy was harder than I expected and kinder than I deserved. I did weekly sessions to unravel gaslighting and trauma, to name the small betrayals and stop apologizing for them. I learned facts about memory and shame, practiced saying sentences like, "You do not get to control my access to space," and learned how slow healing is a job you must go to every day. Dr. Hayes and my therapist helped me translate humiliation into a plan. I worked to fix the financial mess too, calling banks, disputing charges, closing accounts, and setting fraud alerts. The banks reversed some of the credit card balances, and a partial restitution payout covered back rent and therapy bills, while I worked with the university's student accounts office to correct ledgers. The $22,000 in fraudulent cards didn't vanish overnight, but every call and every notarized form felt like a small excavation of truth. At school, I finished the compressed coursework with help I couldn't repay. Sophie and Jamal and a few other classmates sat with me through long study nights, and professors who had seen the evidence bent deadlines and offered feedback. I earned the grades I needed, and a year later secured a paid research position that made my bank account stop trembling. The job helped me breathe and rebuild credit slowly and honestly. Seeing Madison's mugshot online was complicated and hollow. It registered like a fact and not a catharsis. I felt relief and an ache that victory hadn't healed the family. Some relatives called to say they were sorry and asked how they could help. Others didn't answer at all. Laura and James kept a distance, their voices thin and rare when they did reach out. The split at holiday tables left a quiet I had to learn to live in. A partial restitution check landed months after sentencing, and the money covered therapy and moving expenses more than anything else. I rented a small apartment across state lines with brighter windows and a landlord who did not care about family stories. The move felt like a practical exhale: cartons, a mattress set up under new light, a kettle that made honest noise. The heater hummed like the garage once had, but it was mine now and not a soundtrack for shame. Then something improbable: acceptance into a graduate program across the country with a fellowship that covered tuition and living costs. The offer felt like proof that the life that had been stolen could be reordered. I packed what I could, said the necessary goodbyes, and boarded a plane with a single backpack and a folder of stamped documents, restitution receipts, police reports, a stack of letters from people who had helped prove the truth. The last image that sits with me, quiet and definite, is simple. I walk the hallway of my new apartment in a pair of boots that make a clean, loud sound on the laminate floor. I step hard, not to punish anyone, not to perform, but because I can. The echo is pure and mine, one foot after another, the sound of reclaimed space. I think then that some boundaries must be enforced to survive, that saying no can save you, and that a single, intentional step can be quiet defiance and a new way forward.